I would like to begin this morning with a point of personal privilege and thank everyone for their text and phone calls and cards and messages after the unexpected death of my grandfather a week ago today. Thank you to the church staff, Bruce and Lori, especially for working around me while I was out of town. Thank you to everyone here for just being so loving and supportive and for praying for me and the repose of my grandfather's soul and for the comfort and consolation of my family, especially my grandmother. And I want to thank the vestry also for their care and support. Last week was a difficult week for my family. It was a hard week for me. He was my grandfather, yes, but in many ways more like a father to me. He married my grandmother just a few years before I was born, and the two of them, already being in their midlives, did not have any children together, and so he often claimed that I was their child. As I mentioned last week, I spent every weekend with them, and when I was born, until my mother married the man who would adopt me as his son, I lived with my grandparents. And so for all intents and purposes, I was their son. I was fortunate to be able to bury my papa. It and every burial that I've done was such a privilege. Many of you will remember meeting him when he visited here many times since I came here, and also when he came and painted the education building. He was a hard worker up to his last day, and just the week before he died, he mowed something like 10 yards in a single day, all at 87 years old. And he loved coming to church here. He didn't always know when to stand or when to sit or when to kneel, but he always insisted on sitting on the front row. But that's just the kind of man that he was. He wanted to support those that he loved, and he wanted them to know that he supported them. He gave so much of himself, and he loved with a love as strong as death, as Solomon says. Passion fierce as the grave. And that showed. His funeral and his wake was attended by over 600 people. And the church was standing room only. And there were so many more who wanted to be there but couldn't make it. And each one was a life that he touched. Each one was a person that he loved and that loved him in return. And while he was far from a perfect man, he was a man who earnestly and deeply loved people. And he loved Jesus. He didn't know a thurible from an acolyte, but he knew the cross of Christ. And he knew that the victory of the cross stood over and above the sins of the world. And he knew that the victory of the empty tomb was worth more than all the kingdoms of the earth. And so, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your prayers and consolations and condolences. And please keep praying for us, especially my grandmother, Chris. Many of you know the struggle of the journey that she is beginning. And many of you here know, in ways that many of us can't, just how important prayer in community is to walking in the path that she now finds herself on. So the sermon this week is short. Christ is king, and for Christ to be king means that Caesar is not. What then is power? What then is wealth? What then are all the trappings and comforts of this world? For when even the last ounce of gold has rusted, and the final stone is thrown from the last palace, Christ remains enthroned upon the praises of his people, of every generation, and gives us the kingdom prepared from the foundation of the world. And if we are keen to inherit this promised blessing, then we had better make our way to the altar of the Most High God, and prepare to wear that crown of glory, if but only to cast our crown before him. And if you're unsure, or you think you're unworthy, or think that you're just not strong enough, let me remind you that when we gather at this table, we join with angels, archangels, and all of the company of heaven, all of our beloved dead, all the saints and sinners who have found rest in the bosom of Christ, the firstborn of the dead. And if Christ can make even the dead sing the praises of the Most High God, imagine what he can do with you who still has breath in your lungs and blood in your veins. What we do here is more than a mere comfort. It's more than a mere ritual. It's more than a simple gathering. What we do here is as serious as life and death, because it is here that we bring forth the offering of our lives, the sacrifice of our praise and thanksgiving, and lay it before the throne of Christ's cross. Because it is by that cross that he has redeemed the world and called it to himself. And this is how we pay homage to our King. This is how we practice for the everlasting praise we yearn to give to the King of life and peace. This is how we praise the name that is above every name. As St. Paul said, as often as we eat this bread and drink this cup, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. And now, as Sirach says, we could say more, but we could never say enough. Let the final word be, he is the all.